And we're live. Okay, great. Welcome to the show, Mohamed Zeeshan.
Great. Thank you for having me, Anwesh. Absolute pleasure.
So just to give the audience who might or might not know you a brief introduction. You are a student. You just passed out from Columbia University in international diplomacy, if I'm not wrong, international relations. And you have worked with UN, and you have a recent book out on international relations, Flying Blind, published by Penguin, which, I haven't read it, but going through the reviews, it seems to be pretty interesting. So congratulations on your recent book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. So I want to start by talking about something that you wrote on a newspaper column, which is that, about India's declining image across the world. You cited Freedom House report and other reports in that. So do you think first that Freedom House report in particular was accurate entirely? Do you agree with this methodology and everything? And do you think that it's accurate in its conclusion of India being partly free?
Look, I'm not qualified to talk about the theory behind it and the methodology behind it or the research behind it. I think that would be something that is, better left to surveyors and people who have a record of collecting data from the field on these things. However, I think that some of the conclusions that not just Freedom House, but several of the entities and think tanks spread out around the world have been coming to regarding India are rooted in some substance and in some ground reality. And the ground reality is that India is, as a country, I think, moving towards sort of a kind of an ethnic nationalist paradigm. Even though secularism was at one point in time a founding principle of the Indian Republic, today it has become, in some sense, a bad word. And mainstream politics has started to treat this, or at least parts of mainstream politics have started to treat this as a mistake in some sense on the part of India's founding fathers, and that we need to, in some sense, rectify it. And so what we are seeing, I think, is a movement, political movement, to undo or to change the fundamental character of the Indian Republic and change the way that India has been defined as a nation over these last 7 decades. And in doing so, I think that quite obviously people have pointed out that the government has been imprisoning journalists, using quite liberally, colonial laws such as the sedition law, using quite liberally draconian acts such as the UAPA Act and so on. And it has been recorded as well by some researchers that the usage of some of these laws has actually increased in the last few years. So clearly things are changing. They are not the way that they used to be, say about a decade ago. And that is what a lot of these, entities and researchers and commentators are talking about, around the world. They're saying that in some sense, India is changing fundamentally.
Right. So I really want to go to the Freedom House report in particular because there are different categories of it, and you as an international relations, you as a student of that would be able to better articulate it than me. So the Freedom House report, when it comes to judiciary, one of the categories is judiciary. The ratings declined from 3 to 2. And in my opinion, in the writings of that particular report, it was based on Ranjan Gogoi being elected as to the Rajya Sabha, which to me seems to be quite arbitrary, which is that, and the other caveats, other reasons where the Ayodhya judgment, So to me, there seems to be that they're arguing that there is a collision between the judiciary and the government. But uh, from my perspective, it looks like there is no clear evidence of that collusion. What we have instead is a perception of that collusion. So how do you justify this?
Look, I mean, the only way to get evidence on something of this kind would be to probably conduct a sting operation and prove that there was some kind of communication between the executive and the judiciary, in this case, whereby, you know, the judiciary or rather a particular judge had taken place in a quid pro quo transaction. And you're right, you know, such an operation has not been conducted as yet. And so therefore it seems that that kind of evidence is not out there. But I think that, you know, the concern that if a sitting judge becomes, following his retirement from the judiciary, becomes a political appointee of any kind, whether that is a governor of a state or a Rajya Sabha nominated member, you know, obviously these political appointments in some sense are decided by the executive or the government of the day. And so the concern that some people have that, you know, this is a bad precedent in that if judges who are serving right now in the Supreme Court or other levels of the judiciary come to see that, well, you know, if we pass judgments that are in favor of the government politically, then maybe we can hope for these sorts of political appointments following retirement. That sort of a concern is a very valid concern. I think this is something that we need to look at from a systemic point of view. That in the Indian system, a sitting judge in the judiciary following his retirement from the Supreme Court or other levels of the judiciary can aspire to become a political appointee. This does not exist in the United States, for instance, where a Supreme Court judge essentially serves for life. And so therefore, the executive in some sense does not have this carrot in their hand that they can use in order to sway that judge while they are serving in the Supreme Court one way or the other. Whereas in India, the fact is that that carrot exists. Whether that carrot was used in this particular example, in this particular case, or whether it has been used in the past is irrelevant. The point is that it exists. And so therefore, the fact that this carrot exists means that there is an opportunity for a government, if it wants to do so, it has an opportunity to compromise the independence of the judiciary. And the concern being raised is that we need to think about whether we need to reform the system as it exists. I did an interview with a former judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Gopala Gowda, you know, for the Freedom Gazette a few months ago. I think immediately following the appointment of Justice Ranjan Gogoi to the Rajya Sabha, and I asked him quite pointedly whether, you know, judges of the Supreme Court should be allowed after retirement to become governors and MPs in the Rajya Sabha. And he agreed and admitted that, you know, if you look at it objectively, then the fact is that the system is built in such a way that if a judge can become a political appointee after retirement, then obviously, you know, that means that the government can actually influence the judiciary in some way or the other. So this is a concern that has been noted by former judges and other jurists in the past, and I think it's something we need to think about reforming.
Certainly, well, I agree with you on that. Another thing which is, I think, is raised as or is claimed to be a systematic issue is the implementation of the Citizenship Amendment Act. And people claim, and I think you would also claim, that this act is in itself a discriminatory act. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Look, the concern that I've had right from the get-go, among several concerns I have with this law, is how is this law going to be implemented? How do you ascertain the religion or religious identity of a person? You'd have to do it from their name. But, you know, if my name is Mohamed Zeeshan and then I tell the government that I'm a Christian, how is the government going to dispute that? How are they going to prove it one way or the other? And there is no registry, so far as I know, in India that records the religion of a person. If you wanted to give citizenship to people on the basis of whether they're married or not, that is possible, because we do require by law, people who get married to register themselves. And so the government, in some sense, knows who is married and who is not. The government does not know the religious identity or religious belief of a person, and this is something that a person can change as they go. You could be Christian today and then Muslim tomorrow, and vice versa. You could be Hindu today and then Jain tomorrow or Sikh tomorrow. These things one changes, and so on what basis do you implement a law of this kind? That is point number one. Point number two,
Well,
obviously, is go ahead.
Well, to that, I would say that there is a specific deadline. So it's not for all Hindus or all Muslim, Christians,
Right.
Jains. For some Hindus, and in some period, if those who were Hindus in that particular period, and it was in their, say, passport or things like that, then they would be admitted. And if they can prove that they were persecuted, well, good enough. So I think that
No,
is
but even that, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, for that, I have that again raises, for one, it raises the question of then how are you going to implement it? The Indian passport, for instance, does not show religion. So now the Indian government needs to start recording the religious identity of people. That in itself is, that is a change. So that's one. And if you are doing it in some sense retrospectively, then again, how do you prove one way or the other? So far as I know, I can't think of a single document that can prove whether a person is a Muslim or a Christian. I, for instance, don't have an Indian document that tells me that I'm a Muslim or not, because the Indian government does not issue such documents. Whether Bangladesh and Pakistan and Afghanistan are doing it, I don't know. If they are, then that becomes perhaps a documentation. If they are not, then how do you ascertain this? The other point, obviously, is that this cutoff date itself is arbitrary. It defeats the purpose. Why do you have this cutoff date? And then what happens to people who are religiously persecuted after that? What are you going to do about them? So why do we have this cutoff date? It sort of, in some sense, goes against the very intent of the law itself, which is to save people who are under religious persecution. Is it that India is saying that religious persecution just ceased to happen in these countries after 2014, and therefore we do not need to save people who have been persecuted for their religion after this date? Or is this just a date that is arbitrarily cooked in because logistically speaking we cannot do it in any other way? And obviously, further than that, as several people have pointed out, and as I myself have written in the past, there are obviously several people in these countries that are persecuted for being Muslim itself, just being the wrong sect, or being rationalists or other things like that, but they have Muslim names. So as Suhasini Haider pointed out to me in one of my podcasts with her recently, people like Hamid Karzai, for instance, who are being persecuted by religious extremists for a very long time in Afghanistan, would now not be eligible to come to India and make use of this law and take shelter in India. So there are several questions to be asked. And the point is, if you really wanted to save the lives of people who are being persecuted for their religion, you can do this on a case-by-case basis without having a law of this kind. And India has been doing it in the past. We took in, Buddhists from Tibet after they were being persecuted. The Dalai Lama essentially operates out of India and has been for the last several decades. We have been taking in religiously persecuted Jews and others from the Middle East and elsewhere around the world for several generations as well. We've been doing this for several years, several generations, without needing to bring in a law that essentially says that we are going to divide and judge an Indian citizen on the basis of whether they are Muslim or not Muslim. So there was no need for a law of this kind. We already had a system in place that was working. We probably just needed to strengthen that and make sure that we were probably taking in a larger number of refugees than we are taking right now. And that could have been done very easily by the government through a much more inclusive mechanism.
But states do have a right to decide who they want to admit as citizens or not. So I would like to know, because many have argued that this is in itself unconstitutional, goes against the principles of the preamble of the Constitution itself. So was the government within its right to bring in this law, or is this law violating the Constitution?
No, I think as far as I know, the idea of citizenship comes under the union list. The parliament can legislate on that. I don't, in fact, I tend to agree with scholars who say that state governments can only, they can't, in principle, they cannot reject a law passed by the parliament on a subject that is under the union list. And so if a Citizenship Amendment Act has been duly passed by the parliament, then state governments cannot declare that to be null and void. They will have to abide by that for the most part. However, obviously there have been petitions that have been presented before the Supreme Court, which are currently under discussion on whether this law is itself constitutional or not. State legislatures, as far as I know, may not be able to decide upon this, but the Supreme Court certainly can decide whether it is in keeping with the basic structure of the Constitution and the basic principles of the Constitution or not. And I certainly do hope that the Supreme Court, takes a decision that is in keeping with our very rich history and legacy as a secular republic.
Right. So, as a scholar, do you think academic freedom has declined in this country in the last few years?
I mean, look, you can't deny. I think most people cannot deny the fact that there is an atmosphere of fear and intimidation in India. In that, people would like to say or write things, but they don't want to because they are afraid of retributive attacks from radical extremists, or censure from the government. Use of the sedition law and all of these sorts of things on various different grounds. And this atmosphere, in my opinion, has certainly deteriorated over a period of time. I think that academics and writers and journalists 10 years ago in India did not have the level of fear that they feel today in writing and speaking what they want to write and speak. The cases of Pratap Bhanu Mehta recently and others recently, and the jailing and imprisonment of various journalists kind of, I think, goes to the crux of this issue that, people who are even well-established academics today sort of are operating in an environment where universities or media outlets are not in a position to protect them and give them safety, and they would rather let them go. Government is able to use various incentives, financial, legal, and otherwise, to make this happen. And in the case of Pratap Bhanu Mehta, for instance, there was a speculation that Ashoka University had to let him go or ask him to leave because they were not going to be able to operate freely otherwise, and transact business with the government otherwise, perhaps because they feared that the government would boycott them. And these things are telling. I think there is clearly an atmosphere. It's very difficult to prove it one way or the other, except through anecdotes and examples of the kind that we both know. But the fact that there is an atmosphere of fear, I think, to me, is quite clear.
Well, to me, it seems like all of, even if we agree on what you're saying, that there is, in fact, an academic restriction of academic freedom, I would say that for now, there is no state intervention to prove it. Just like we have, let's say, in Pakistan, which is that the state dictates what's written in the textbooks, and the textbooks are extremely biased to one side and demonize a certain country or a certain community. we don't have that in
Well,
India
I'd
as
push
of.
back on that. I would push back on that because there have been cases in Gujarat and Rajasthan, for instance, Rajasthan under the previous government and Gujarat even in recent times, where reports have said that textbooks and especially history textbooks that were written and published by the state government actually whitewash certain parts of Indian history, or for instance removed inferences or removed references to certain people from Indian history. And that clearly had a political undertone. And people have been talking about the saffronization of education in India in this manner, particularly in some of the North Indian states. I don't think it's happening pan India. Certainly, I agree, and it hasn't, so far as I know, taken place from the central government level. But some state governments are certainly whitewashing our history textbooks and preaching or teaching the next generation a sort of an alternative reading or version of history, and that is happening. But I think also that the fact that there have been cases in the past where vice chancellors of universities have been talking about ancient test tube babies or ancient rockets and satellites and things like that. And the official government has given sanction to some of these things. Union ministers have talked about it. Even the prime minister has talked about some of these dubious things. I think are all causes for worry and concern, certainly, that in India today, there is an effort even by the government itself to remake and remodel education in India in a way that gives credibility and credence to alternative facts, so to speak, if not outright lies.
Yeah, well, I think you're talking about the Dinanath Batra textbooks in Gujarat, and it has also textbooks were also changed during Bajpayee terms, but in Narendra Modi's NDA too, not much change has happened in the central level or in the CBSE textbooks, let's say. And I think that the textbooks, well, first of all, they need to be changed because they only portray certain part of history, and I think they're extremely biased. And certain states and their history are completely ignored. I did not learn in my CBSE textbooks about Odisha at all; like it was barely mentioned.
Right.
Or the eastern states or the southern states are often ignored. Kerala is often ignored, and we only learn
Right.
about the North Indian states. So in that sense, the
That's
textbooks
right.
do need to be changed, but it
Yeah,
has to
I
be
agree.
done through an academically rigorous manner.
That's right.
But
Absolutely.
yep. So tell me, how exactly has is what is happening now different from what has happened before? Because the central argument I think people are making is that um, India is very different now today than it was years ago, as you pointed out, and that things have become worse. But in my opinion, if you look at it from a legal perspective, then all throughout Indian history, there was no absolute freedom of speech in our entire history. In fact, these sedition laws and the First Amendment was introduced and strengthened by the likes of Nehru's regime and Indira Gandhi's regime. In fact, Nehru, many people forget, jailed Majru Sultan Puri simply for writing a poem, and he was jailed for 2 years. And there was also the this CBFC, the Film Cinematograph Act, was specifically introduced to restrict what can or cannot be said in movies, right? So, in my opinion, the institutional mechanism has always been there, and it is merely been exploited by this government, and it was exploited in the past by other governments, by UPA. UPA had also jailed Arundhati Roy and many other people on the charges of sedition. So to me, it does not appear like we are at a point where it's specifically getting worse.
Yes and no. I agree insofar as the fact that these institutional mechanisms have always existed. You're right. The loopholes, if you will, have always existed. India has never enjoyed absolute freedom of speech. You're absolutely right. And in fact, as I was saying earlier as well, in the case of the judiciary, for instance, the fact that a sitting judge of the Supreme Court after retirement can be given political appointment. That's a feature of the Indian law. And it's always been that way. It's just that this government has used it. Previous governments didn't use it as much. But some of the numbers are also quite striking. I don't have them in front of me right now, but a quick Google search would show that the incidence of the use of sedition law to imprison journalists has increased in the last few years as compared to earlier. The imprisonment of journalists itself under various laws has also increased in the last few years as compared to earlier. So the numbers are getting worse in some sense. I'm not saying that they never used to happen in the past. As you pointed out, they were happening earlier. It's just that it's happening a lot more frequently now. And I think, what probably riles some of the liberals is that it's happening under a political dispensation that has actively and proactively explicitly said that it wants to change certain parts of the Indian national identity, that we need to become a Hindu Rashtra, no longer, do away with secularism as a concept because it's in some sense bad or misused in the Indian context. So there is clearly an effort, I think, at least within the, I don't know whether this government, this government to some extent is doing it, but in some sense, the rationale of the Hindu nationalist political movement is that it wants to revise and change what India's national identity is. And so seeing these case numbers and instances increase under that kind of a government tends to, I think, alarm certain people and concern certain people because they obviously connect the two and they say that this is happening under this government because they are trying to change what India is and what India stands for. Whereas previous governments had kind of played, with the constitution and gone with the flow and had not made a serious attempt to change India's national identity as such. And we can't forget that there have been several very controversial, landmark decisions and policies under this government, the revocation of autonomy in Kashmir being one, and the Citizenship Amendment Act being one. And such laws and rules were not quite so frequently passed under previous governments, including the first term of Narendra Modi's government itself. So there is clearly a change in all these aspects. And I think that sort of makes dissidents a bit wary to say, well, we want to oppose these things, and yet at the same time we are seeing that a lot of people are getting arrested, or increasing number of people are getting arrested for speaking out against these things, and that all of these things put together in some sense, to many people tells a sadder story than what we had earlier.
But here is what I think, that we have a free speech problem. And that problem will not be solved if tomorrow, for instance, Narendra Modi's government loses the election and the UPA government comes on. It's not going to go away magically because these laws are already there. So what we need to do, if we really want to improve, is to actually change these laws and do away with these laws. And I don't see that in either the BJP or the Congress. And maybe you'll be surprised to know that it was the BJP's founder, Syama Prasad Mukherjee, who advocated against sedition when it was introduced by the Nehru's regime. Like, he advocated for free speech and advocated to do away with the First Amendment, which was introduced specifically to restrict free speech. So how do you think these institutional changes are going to come? Because I don't see any party willing to do that.
Look, the unfortunate fact of politics is that whoever is in opposition would always like the government to be less powerful. And whoever, when you're in opposition, regardless of whether you are radical or not, you would like to see the sedition law removed. You would like to see free speech being absolute because you're not in power. And as soon as you come to power, obviously you have an incentive regardless of whether you're right wing or left wing, to continue this. And that is the unfortunate problem that we are facing, in that, we have set the precedent. Several of these institutional mechanisms already, and loopholes already existed, as you said. But the fact that they are being used and misused more frequently means that we are in a spiral where, even if the government changes, as you pointed out, the next government would have an incentive to continue doing this. You often say, you often hear BJP supporters saying, oh, Indira Gandhi had done this during the emergency, so what's the big deal today? And future governments will again, say that, look, Narendra Modi had set the bar there and he had done all of these things, so what is the big deal? We can also do it, right? So there's always going to be this whataboutery that takes place, and the next government is going to be as bad, if not worse, as this one, or would have an incentive to be as bad, if not as worse, as this one. And I think that is why it's very, very important today to lobby with political parties across the spectrum, to commit them or hold them accountable to bringing a change in all of these laws, as you pointed out, and talk about reforming these things institutionally. That's one of the things that I'm hoping that the Freedom Gazette would be able to do in the long run, bringing these sorts of policy ideas and solutions and principles into mainstream discourse, and building a bit of a constituency or an audience that would be able to lobby parties that are in the opposition today to say, look, when you come to power in the future, you've got to commit to doing all of these things. And if you don't, then what is going to be the repercussion? We've got to start building political alternatives that sort of put pressure along these things. And I think people in India, as a population, as a nation, need to start believing that we need more democracy and not less democracy, that we need more free speech, not less free speech. I think that there is still a sense, in my opinion, within Indian society that some restrictions are quote unquote reasonable and therefore they should exist, that free speech should not be absolute, or that governments are within their rights to do some of these things because that's the only way to get reforms passed in a country as chaotic and diverse as India. All of these things are deep-seated beliefs in large parts of the Indian population, whether they are left-wingers or right-wingers. And today, since the right wing is in power, obviously more right-wingers would feel that the government is justified in using these means, and fewer left-wingers would feel that there should be reasonable restrictions on free speech. So in some sense, that brings me to the question of social reform itself, in that as a society, I think regardless of whether we are BJP supporters or Congress supporters or Trinamool Congress supporters or whoever else, we've got to believe that in principle, regardless of who is in power, free speech restrictions can be misused and are misused, and that in the long run is detrimental to society and to the economy and to democracy as a whole.
Well, I do agree with that. I think that the majority of people in India do agree that the restrictions in free speech are important. And I think we need to dispel that myth as soon as possible. And if people start believing that, we actually need more free speech, that, these restrictions are arbitrary and that offending or mocking a religion or a religious figure should be allowed, as soon as the people get this, we will have free speech, because there will be a lot of pressure from the people and the state will not be able to do anything else, just like we have in France, let's say.
Right.
But this perception of the BJP promoting Hindu Rashtra, which you talked about before, I think that a lot of people in the BJP, a lot of BJP members have indeed talked about the Hindu Rashtra and have indeed increased animosity between groups. But all political parties have done that, like all kinds of political parties have done that. So if I'm to believe that the BJP is in any way special than those political parties, that it really means what it says, and that these people are actually going to change the very fabric of the Indian state itself, then I have to look at what the BJP's manifesto says and what the BJP's constitution says. And when I read the BJP's constitution, in the first line, there is an admission that secularism an adherence to secularism, let's say, that the BJP, anyone who joins this party has to believe in secularism, has to believe in the constitution, has to believe in democracy, and has to believe that the state, no, there shall be no official religion in the of the state. This is in the BJP's constitution itself. So how do we make sense of it? Like, do we just say that the BJP believes in Hindu Rashtra because people in the BJP, a few people in the BJP say they believe in that they want to base the Indian state on a certain kind of Hinduism, or like how do we come to this conclusion?
Look, you've got to look at the actions and the beliefs of the supporters as well as leaders of the BJP. If we are a secular state, then, take the case of the Ram Mandir religious ceremony. I have nothing, I'm honestly going to be very happy once the Ayodhya dispute is forgotten. I'm very happy that the Supreme Court has passed a judgment on it. The temple is being built. We should leave it at that. The ghosts of history should no longer define our future. But if a political party truly believes in secularism, why is it that the prime minister attends and conducts and heads a religious ceremony at a temple? Is this going to be the precedent and expectation set for future prime ministers in India as well? Will future prime ministers of India also be expected to be a quote unquote custodian of the Ram Mandir, lead religious ceremonies there like the prime minister did during the inauguration? What was the deal with that? And similarly, what's the deal with the Citizenship Amendment Act? And why is it that leaders of the BJP, ministers in the BJP, who say odious things about Muslims or Christians, etc., why is it that they are not expelled from the party? Why do they continue to be in the party? So you've got to wonder how these actions, sort of tally up with the words of the BJP. And you've also got to wonder whether, how do supporters of the BJP and people who join the BJP think about this? Are they saying, do they really take this commitment to secularism in the BJP constitution seriously? Or do they just see this as something that is politically expedient at the time? Because, if they say that we want to do away entirely with secularism and then writes that into the BJP constitution, is that in some sense going to make the BJP an unconstitutional party or a party in violation of the constitution? These are questions to be asked. And is it therefore, that is why the BJP constitution has this written into its constitution? So, there are several possibilities here. Maybe they are doing it for political expediency purposes. Maybe this is going to change in the constitution in the years ahead. Maybe supporters do not believe in it, but they're doing it because otherwise it would become a case of contravening Indian law. I don't know. It's something that we are going to have to look at to figure out in the years ahead. But the question needs to be asked: why is it that only the BJP kind of partakes in these sorts of religious actions, in some sense, as opposed to a more secular post-identity politics mindset that would ideally be the case in a truly secular republic?
But hasn't the Congress also taken part in these like religious action? Like it was
yes, you're
after
absolutely right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the cow slaughter ban
yes,
in the case of under Indira Gandhi, you're absolutely right. This was,
and it
it's
was
been a
the
case
Congress who
of,
introduced the cow slaughter in the fundamental directive principles of
yeah,
state policy.
yeah, you're right. So, this, you're absolutely right. I think that in India, there is a norm of identity politics that is very, very deeply rooted, because political parties believe that India is an extremely religious country, and therefore, in order to win votes in a religious country, you've got to be religious. Whether you are Muslim or Hindu or Christian, it doesn't matter. If you're going and asking for votes from a Muslim constituency, then you wear the skull cap and go to the mosque. If you are asking for votes from a Christian constituency, then you wear the cross and go to the church. If you're asking for votes from a Hindu constituency, then you ban cow slaughter, you wear the Hindu religious clothes, you partake in Hindu religious ceremonies, and so on. This is a norm of Indian politics that has taken or brought us to the point where we are today. And so the only way to get out of this, as I see it, a spiral into religious extremism and religious identity politics, is to keep politics separate from religion and create a political alternative in some sense. The Congress can do it today, now that they are in the opposition. They can say that what we did in the past was wrong. We're not going to do that anymore. We are a new Congress party. They can absolutely do that. Or other political parties like the Aam Aadmi Party or whoever else wants to build a post-identity politics scenario can also certainly do that. But again, it brings me down to the point of social reform, because it seems to me that Indian society at large and most Indian people like identity politics and want identity politics. They want their political parties to represent their religious identity, whether that's Hindu or Muslim. They want political parties to represent their caste identity. They want these political parties to represent their linguistic identity as well. They don't want, I think, for the most part, at least so far as we can see, there's no evidence that there is a sizable enough constituency across India that wants a political party or a political alternative that eschews all of these and avoids all of these sorts of identity politics and says that we are going to represent the interests of the Indian people, the aspirational interests of the Indian people, regardless of whether you are Hindu or Muslim, whatever else. And we want you guys to practice your religion on the streets and at home as you want to, and not infringe and comment on the rights and freedoms and individual liberties of other people. But at the same time, we are not going to decide for you whether you are Hindu or Muslim. We are not going to come out and say that we are Hanuman Bhakts or Ram Bhakts or Maulanas. So that sort of a political alternative so far has not taken root in India in mainstream politics. And the only way that it's going to take root is if, as a society, we decide that we do not want to have this kind of identity politics anymore. We want to have a politics that is much more inclusive, much more uniting, much more secular in nature.
Yeah, well, I think that this mentality is keeping us bogged down in the same way that before liberalization, India was kept bogged down by this sort of Swaraj sort of mentality, homemade things. And in my opinion, I think that in India, there exists animosities between the two communities, two main communities, and it is foolish to deny that those animosities exist. Now, we can argue and debate about why those animosities exist, but there is a sort of conflict, and in my opinion, that conflict arises partly because of economic reasons. And as India becomes economically more industrialized, like, we don't like to admit it, but we're essentially a partly feudal pre-industrial society, right? So as soon as India industrializes and focuses on free market and promotes more libertarian policies, that these animosities and incidents of lynching and law and order problems will eventually vanish, as it happens in every third world country. Is that a perception with which you agree?
I mean, look, I honestly don't know what to make of this. Part of me doesn't agree with this because it seems to me that our communal tensions have gotten worse with economic growth. In that people, the animosity that you describe, it's very difficult again to prove something of this kind, right? It's a question of what we see in our politics, and our politics today seems to me much more religiously polarized than it was several years ago. Even the post-partition independent India that we had, the 50s and the 60s, where my grandfather and others grew up, when I talk to people who grew up in those days around me, at least anecdotally, they tell me that the communal tensions that we see today in India are much more exacerbated and much more prominent than they were back then. Neighbors, these days are much more suspicious of each other. And, maybe it also has to do something with the fact that when you're living in a village, when you're living in a rural setup, everybody knows each other. All the neighbors know each other a lot better. You grow up together, you went to school together, etc., etc. And so there is a higher level of trust between neighbors in a rural countryside setting than there is in an urban setting where, it's a lot more transactional, much more mechanical. People are somewhat more impersonal, a lot busier, obviously, and the community setup and community feeling that one feels in a village is in some sense definitely missing in the city, where everybody is pretty much on their own and everybody, each man is fighting for himself. So this can be argued both ways. But on the other hand, as you pointed out, as there was at least an expectation and a hope, including from people like myself, that as India urbanized more, identity politics would weaken because people would start seeing each other as individuals more than Muslims or Hindus or Dalits or anything else. You go and sit in a restaurant, you're not thinking about whether the waiter is a Muslim or a Dalit. You're just ordering food. When you hire somebody, you're not thinking about whether he's a Muslim or a Dalit. You hire whoever is best fit for that job. That was a hope and expectation that people like me certainly had with urbanization in India. And that's the hope that I had with the kind of economic growth that we saw through the 90s and the 2000s. But what's now happened is, obviously we've now had cases where people have said, oh, if my Zomato driver, delivery boy is a Muslim, I don't want to take the food from him. Or if my Uber cab driver is a Muslim, I don't want to sit in the Uber cab with him. So these sorts of instances have started to come up, which kind of actually runs against the expectations that I had, that, in an urban setting, there would be more anonymity and there would be more sort of focus on economic issues, and as a result, identity issues would become weaker. But that is, it's not happening today. One could also argue, I suppose, and it remains to be seen through academic research which of these theories are really true. One could argue that in the last few years, the Indian economy has actually slowed. The growth rates that we enjoyed in the 2000s and in the 90s are no longer available. We are not growing at that GDP growth rate, and so therefore jobs are being lost much more frequently today. Obviously, with COVID-19 and the lockdown that took place, migrant workers had to go back home. Daily wage laborers were thrown out of their jobs and livelihoods. Many people, even in the formal sector, lost their jobs. So I think that as the economy weakens, certainly the resentment would increase and people would start sort of, let's say, resorting to their identity a lot more as a bargaining power to get access to more economic opportunities. And that, and you see this with these agitations for greater reservation quotas from different communities. It's essentially that people are resorting to their community identity or communal identity to say, let us band together and ask for more from the government because economic situation is very dire. So that is another concern that I certainly see in the years ahead, in that if the economy does not do better, then certainly, as you pointed out, these things are going to get worse.
Right. So one could also argue, in my opinion, that the communal tension were always there, but they were latent, that communities were essentially living apart from each other. There was not much interaction. So those communal tensions were only seen partly. But as India has urbanized more and these communities are coming face to face with each other, that latent sort of feeling of animosity is coming out, that people are becoming more vocal about it. And, that it's going to eventually sort of settle down and stabilize as, our economy improves. What do you think about
That's
that?
an interesting theory, and I can see the logic behind that. I've not read much research into these things, if there has been done in the academia, but there was there was one scholar whose name I do not now recall. He wrote an article, I think, in the Hindustan Times last year. I'm not able to recall his name, but he was talking about how with the growth of the Indian economy through the 90s and the 2000s, a lot of people migrated from villages to the cities. A lot of the people who migrated were also escaping caste tensions from the villages. So lower caste people who were migrating to the cities in search for economic opportunities, they were also fleeing caste oppression in many of their villages. And when they came to the city, certainly they tried to, in the opinion of the scholar, they tried to, in some sense, ape the elite, upper class elite, or upper
Oh,
class and
are you talking about Sanskritization?
yes, I think
M.N.
that is what this
Yes,
theory is.
M.N.
I
Roy, he
don't.
was a sociologist. Yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, he is the one. So this theory certainly seemed very interesting to me. I hadn't thought about it in this light before I came across him. But it's. I think India is, just by virtue of being so large and diverse, a lot of these things that sound contradictory could be quite true as well. And it depends on which part of India you're looking at. I think that the Sanskritization theory of M.N. Roy, in large part, to my mind, seems to be what has happened in North India, where the caste equations were very dominant, and as a result, um, uh, obviously people were fleeing their villages for the cities in order to get away from caste oppression. And you find that the rise of Hindu nationalism in North India, as opposed to in South India, is kind of gives credibility and credence to that theory and its conclusion. Whereas in South India, you do not see that as much, in my opinion. And in South India, language becomes, in some sense, a unifier. In states like Kerala, for instance, across Hindus and Muslims and Christians. In Karnataka, caste becomes a factor. So there, the diversity of India makes this a very, very difficult question to resolve. To say that the flow is one way or the other.
Right. So I hear a lot about this idea of India becoming a superpower, that we are Biswa Guru or whatever. So, and to me, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen in the next 100 years or something. You have written a entire book about it. So, what do you think? Is India a Biswa on its way of becoming a Biswa Guru or whatever that means?
Look, I think if India wants to become a global power in foreign affairs and international politics, India can become that. And in my book, I make the case for that, as you pointed out, along several parameters. I think India is a very unique country in that we have some attributes of developed nations and many attributes of less developed nations as well. And so there is no parallel in international politics to India to compare and say that India is, say, like Japan, or India is like China, or India is like Brazil. I think India is very, very unique. We are a fairly advanced democracy. Obviously, we have been talking about how democracy in India has been backsliding. But we are still a relatively more advanced and stable democracy than you would see in most parts of the developing post-colonial world. In most parts of the post-colonial world, in Africa, for instance, as I write in my book, Africa has seen about 200 civil wars in the last 50, 60 years since the independence movements that got rid of French and British and Portuguese and other colonial control. India has never been through a civil war, unless you count partition as a civil war, but post-independence India has not gone through anything like that, like what Congo has gone through, or like what Nigeria has gone through, or other countries. South Korea, for instance, has gone through. India has not gone through those sorts of bouts of violence that have, in some sense, overthrown democracy or overthrown the political structure as it stands. So in that sense, India has a fairly mature or relatively more advanced, stable democracy. And over the last several years, in fact, Indian institutions like the Reserve Bank of India, like the Election Commission, and other wings of the Indian state have actually been, sort of engaged with as consultants, as advisors by post-colonial countries around the world to help them set up something very similar in their countries. And so there are exchange programs for training between the RBI and countries in East Africa, for instance. And the Election Commission has been an independent election observer in several countries around the world, Sri Lanka, Venezuela, and so on. And so Indian state institutions, in some sense, are widely respected by different countries. Now, the question that I tackle in my book is multifold. One is talking about, first of all, why should India want to be a Vishwa Guru when it has so many developmental challenges? And I argue that if India has a more proactive foreign policy, if India has greater foreign influence around the world, then that would automatically mean that India will be able to fulfill a lot of its developmental objectives. And I talk about how, a weak Indian passport leads to brain drain out of India. And I talk about how more bargaining chips in foreign interactions means that India will be able to sort of conclude more favorable trade deals rather than having to sit out of trade deals as we are doing today. And I talk about how bargaining chips can help save the Indian diaspora and Indian laborers and students and workers stranded in different parts of the world and give them, sort of more access to opportunities in the countries that they live in, and access to higher salaries and access to better living. And as a result, also higher remittances back into India through the diaspora. So there are several reasons for why I say that India should want to expand its global influence today in order to resolve its developmental challenges, in order to increase economic growth at home. And having resolved that, I tackle several other questions along the lines of, okay, India is a stable democracy, so how do we make use of this? And why is this important to India's national power? And how do we make use of this to build influence around the world with different countries? How do we use this to exert influence and sort of win bargaining chips in our bilateral and multilateral negotiations, and so on and so forth? So short answer is that despite its constraints, India actually is in a unique position where it can become a more influential player in international politics. But that would require us to make several bold and creative and imaginative foreign policy decisions.
Do you think one of the reasons we're not able to become a global force is our strict adherence to the non-alignment kind of thinking?
Look, the point that I make in my book is that if you want to build influence over somebody or something, you will have to represent the interests of that entity in a consistent and reliable manner. In other words, they should trust that you will stand up for them. Otherwise, why would they see their welfare in stake in your welfare? And why would they stand up for you? So being consistent, being trustworthy, and being reliable is very, very important. Now, what happens in India's case is two things. One, we either sit on the fence on most issues around the world. And so when we sit on the fence, it means that neither side in any conflict or dispute sees us as an important person because we are simply not helping either of them. Or at worst, we are actually helping both of them. Or we are helping one side today and then the other side tomorrow. Or we are doing military exercises with China today and then military exercises with the Quad tomorrow. Now, what happens as a result of this, and this is what you point out as non-alignment, or it's how it is practiced in India, is that if you are helping both sides of the fence, then obviously both sides are going to be more suspicious of you. Can we trust India to support us today? Is India going to flip around and support the other side tomorrow? Where does India really stand? What does India stand for? What values does India represent? Does India really represent our interests or not? All of these are questions that other countries around the world are actually constantly asking as they see India emerging and rising into a more influential, important player. So India needs to respond to these questions by becoming more consistent in the pursuit of a set of values and a set of interests that we see as being interests that are things that we can represent reliably and trust, constantly, without having to flip flop and commit U-turns every now and then for one reason or the other. So this, I think, is the main concern that I bring up in my book, that we need to be more consistent rather than flip flopping and being non-aligned or sitting on the fence.
So I think one of the reasons, one of the ways India can become a sort of hegemony is by using its soft power. How relevant do you think is soft power to actual international diplomacy? Because in my opinion, there are two ways for India to become a sort of global force. One is the structural part, like the UN security seat or whatever, the structural power, military power, hard
Right.
power. The other is the perception part. India has to be perceived and respected by other countries, otherwise the structural power wouldn't matter. So so do you think we are, in my opinion, we're decreasing in both, but how important do you think is soft power to India's perception?
No, this is a question that I tackle in great depth and detail in Flying Blind. And I point out that India has several unique attributes, that soft power attributes, that are very specific and unique to India. The diaspora is one of them. The appeal of Indian culture around the world is another of them. India's freedom movement, which was a non-violent movement, and the likes of Mahatma Gandhi being seen as icons by people like Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King, that is another factor. India's democracy being a stable and advanced, relatively advanced democracy is another factor. And, all of these things and several other factors that I lay out in my book make Indian soft power quite unique and important. Now, the question is, how do you use this soft power? And, India, for all its soft power so far, has not been able to leverage its soft power very much, except for in some cases. So the nuclear deal was one shining example. The US, for several reasons, had concluded the nuclear deal with India. I list several long-term interests of the US as well in my book for why the US concluded that deal with India and why the US wants India to be in the Security Council and so on. But one of the factors is that the US trusts that India is not going to become a threatening nuclear power to the US's interests, because the US believes that India has several common interests with the US, and therefore, there's no need or reason for India to use its nuclear weapons against the United States. And as a result, America was willing to legitimize India as a nuclear weapon state. By the way, America has not even legitimized Israel's status as a nuclear weapons state to this day. India is the only country that sits outside the NPT and has been given this sort of recognition by America. So, like this, there are several ways, and obviously the role that the Indian American diaspora played in American politics in bringing that nuclear deal to pass was another factor. So India used its soft power to very good effect in getting that nuclear deal done with America years ago. Now, the question that I tackle in my book is, how can we use our soft power implements to build influence more consistently and to become a global leader and to become a global power? And that again brings me to the question of fence sitting and the question of being reliable and being consistent in the pursuit of a set of values and interests. Because if you represent the interests of another person, entity, country, society, community, or whatever it is, then that community or entity or country or society will become beholden to you. And that is how you start, exerting and exercising influence in that country. And so I give examples of several kinds from international politics to show how this can work in India's favor, how India can use its soft power to do this. And certainly there are very fairly simple solutions in some sense that do exist in international politics.
But I think to move away from fence sitting, India has to become closer to the United States because that is the most dominant power currently. But if it moves closer to the United States, that is, if it formally aligns, then there will be problems of the US forcing India to sign the NPT, for instance. So how do we tackle that?
No, I don't think that that's going to happen. And in my book, I explain and argue why. I think in India, if India decides to ally or become a member of a certain bloc, geopolitical bloc, it would have to do that on the basis of common interests. We would need to look at what India's interests are, which, by the way, is what I've done in my book. I've talked about why India should ally with the US. And I've done this on the basis of very basic fundamental interests that long-term fundamental interests that India has as well as that the US has, cutting across politics and economy, society and culture and international norms and global governance and so on. There are several fronts on which I show that India and the US have many common interests. And this is what, in my opinion, makes for a possible alliance. Now, if you look at the way that the US has been treating India so far, the US recognizes that India is not New Zealand. India cannot be bullied around and pushed around because, what are you going to do to India if India doesn't listen? Are you going to sanction India? That's not going to work very well because, India is a very young country, a very large country. And as a result, if the Indian economy does badly, the global economy is going to do badly because the consumer demand that we are building in India is very important to American exports and Chinese exports and everything else. The workforce that we are building in India is very important to the American corporate setup as well, and to the American economy. So India, in many ways, therefore, is already too large and too consequential to be treated the way that a somewhat smaller country or smaller power would be treated. And America recognizes that, I think, and that is why, for instance, India got the waiver on sanctions on Iran, for instance, even from Donald Trump. India got the NPT waiver, and America has been supporting India's inclusion into the nuclear suppliers group. And the way that America has treated countries like Cuba or Iran or North Korea on the nuclear issue is very different from the way that America has treated India. And all of this has to do with the fact that India is not only a large and consequential country, but also that there are several common interests between India and the United States.
Right. So you have argued and written about India being perceived as a sort of hegemon in the South Asian community, South Asian geopolitical place. And in my opinion, to qualify as a hegemon, in the Gramscian sense, as Gramsci used it, India has to be perceived as a hegemon and it has to have structural power. So do you think that India in the South Asian community actually qualifies as a hegemon, or is it just perceived as a hegemon by the other neighboring countries?
Look, I think India lives in the worst of both worlds as far as South Asia is concerned. And I make this very clear in my book. On the one hand, India is very large, geographically located in the center, and obviously, as a result, is much more powerful on all absolute terms than its neighbors. They cannot fight, Bangladesh cannot hope to fight a war against India and win that easily. India can expect to win more easily if it fights against Nepal or Bhutan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, because India simply on absolute terms is much larger and much more advanced. And at the same time, as a result of this, and as a result of what you pointed out just now, the fact is that our neighbors do not trust us. they see us suspiciously because, they think that India is such a very large country, or, and therefore India can hurt us whenever India wants to. So should we, for instance, agree and conclude this trade deal with India? Should we not? Should we support India's rise as a global power at the UN and other places, or should we not? These are all questions that these countries are grappling with every day. And they are also asking whether they should actually counterbalance India's influence or power and threat in South Asia by engaging with China, which is what Nepal did after the constitutional crisis, for instance, and which is what Sri Lanka did under Mahinda Rajapaksa's previous term. So, India in some ways, therefore, actually is at a disadvantage on both sides. On the one hand, we are very large, but despite being large, we do not enjoy influence and goodwill in these countries. And so as a result, we're not able to use them for our foreign policy purposes. We're not able to count on them as reliable allies for our common interests on the world stage, and all of these things. And that's a very difficult nut to crack.
How do we change that?
Well, that's what I talk about in my book. I say that we've got to start pursuing a very difficult philanthropic attitude towards our neighbors, and it needs to be sustained over a long period of time across governments. India has, in many ways, been acting as a suspicious hegemon in South Asia, and I write in my book of several examples of this. One of the striking examples is the friendship treaties that India has with Nepal and Bhutan, under which India essentially actually subjects the arms imports and foreign policy and defense policies of these countries to India's own whims and fancies. And we say, in some sense, a lot of what happens in Nepal and Bhutan, or a lot of what is decided by Nepal and Bhutan in foreign and defense policy, under these treaties is actually subject to India's will and to India's decisions. So there are several cases like this where India has in some sense undermined its own goodwill in the neighborhood by actually trying to build or trying to act like a hegemon, trying to say that we should be the only regional power in South Asia. No other country should have any relationship with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. As soon as they do any business with, say, China, India becomes paranoid. All of these things sort of add to that. And so I think what India needs to do is build or look to build a scenario where the rest of South Asia believes that they have a stake in India's rise and in India's welfare. We need to build a paradigm and policies where India's development in some sense trickles down to the rest of South Asia, or that Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and others are able to gain from what happens in India, are able to gain from India's economic growth and other things. And there are several very easy policies that actually India can pursue in order to make this happen, which I explain and detail out and list out in my book. But the key thrust of it is that we need to be philanthropic. We need to, first of all, recognize that our neighbors are much smaller than we are. And so as a result, if we see them as a threat, just imagine how much of a threat they see us as, just on realistic terms. And so therefore, we need to be sensitive to what they perceive as their interests, and we need to safeguard that and be, in some sense, even altruistic. Expect to give without expecting to get anything in return, and do that over a long period of time in order to build trust.
Yeah, well, we've gone for over an hour now. It was really fantastic talking to you. Do you have any questions for me?
No, I've enjoyed this. I think that this is going to be a great show. I wish you all the very best for your future episodes. And yeah, I certainly do hope, and I look forward to your views on my book when you've had the time to read it. And I certainly do hope that your listeners and viewers also read it.
Yep. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Thank you, Mohamed Zeeshan.
Thank you so much for having me, Anwesh. All the very best.